Good afternoon, and welcome to this panel on the contemporary legacies of slavery, the justice system, which quite honestly would more accurately be called the injustice system. I'm Mark Howard. I'm a professor of government and law and director of the Prisons and Justice Initiative here at Georgetown. I'm one of the speakers, but I've also been asked to jump in and moderate the panel, which I'm happy to do. And I'm joined by four extraordinary and insightful individuals. And in the interest of time, I'll introduce them very briefly now. But as you know, their full bios are in the program and they're worth reading. So I'd like to ask them to turn their cameras on and join me in the gallery view. Welcome. Professor Angela Allen Bell teaches at the Southern University Law Center. She is an absolute legal powerhouse, and among other accomplishments, she played a critical role in Louisiana's recent elimination of the non-unanimous jury rule, which was an utterly racist institution and practice that only disappeared in late 2018. Professor Kristen Henning is director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic at Georgetown University Law Center, and she's also the author of a forthcoming book, The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth, which she'll talk about today. Professor Robin Lenhart also teaches at Georgetown Law, having recently joined us from Fordham Law School, and she's one of the initial co-founders and directors of Georgetown's new Racial Justice Institute. And Tyrone Walker is a prisoner justice advocate at the Justice Policy Institute. He's also an alumnus of the Georgetown Pivot Program, and I'm proud to say that he was my student in the Georgetown Prison Scholars Program at the DC Jail, where he was also a mentor in the Young Men Emerging program. So I'd like to start by setting the stage with some broad comments, and then I'll turn it over to Tyrone Walker, who'll then be followed by Angela Allen Bell, Kristen Jennings, and Robert Lenhart in that order. And let me start by saying that this topic couldn't be more timely and relevant. As Michelle Alexander has shown in her paradigm-shifting book, there's been a direct transition from slavery to convict leasing, which is a critical link to the legal system, and I'll come back to it in a minute, to Jim Crow, and then ultimately today's mass incarceration. Obviously, the circumstances and institutions were different with each of these systems, but there's been a common pattern that has resulted in the exclusion and oppression of African Americans in this country. Convict leasing is the least known and understood of these institutions, but I think it's actually the most important because it added the veneer of due process and the formality of a criminal justice system that is supposedly colorblind and based on fair and just legal principles. Whereas in reality, it recreated a form of slavery, which actually the two leading historians of that era have called slavery by another name, or worse than slavery. And this form not only persisted for almost a century after the end of slavery, but also set up the framework for what later became the two key elements of mass incarceration, which are rogue police actions and ruthless prosecutions, both of which use discretion to unfairly target people of color, while those very same actors face little to no consequences for their actions. Today, of course, the mistreatment and often killing of African Americans by police has become undeniable and frankly graphic for all of us to see. And the justification by police and prosecutors for stops, searches, arrests, and charges often come from prior charges and arrests. So in a sense, they create a self-fulfilling prophecy that conveniently creates a justification that protects them from prosecution themselves, although we'll see if Derek Chauvin gets away with it. Either way, we see a clear legacy of slavery in the continued devaluing of Black lives, of Black pain, Black freedom, and Black humanity. And let's also remember that the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery across the nation, but with a key loophole, which is, quote, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, unquote. So literally, and I mean literally, in the very words of the 13th Amendment of the US Constitution, Slavery did not completely end in 1865, and it continues to exist to this day in American prisons. And think about this. There are more African Americans in prison today than were enslaved in 1850. Of course, it's not a direct comparison given different population sizes, but it is still a very powerful and evocative statistic and very troubling. I also want to raise an important empirical question about the GU 272 descendants. How many of them are currently in prison? How many have been to prison at some point? I think it would be very important to track this and to probe more deeply into the legacy of Georgetown's slavery experience and its connection to criminal justice in prisons. And I hope someone will take on this challenge or join me in doing so. And finally, I want to close by briefly summarizing some of the work that Georgetown's Prisons and Justice Initiative is doing today to combat mass incarceration, which in some sense I think is a form of atonement for its past. I want to highlight 3 programs in particular. First, our Making an Exoneree program, which is a class that I co-teach with my childhood friend, Marty Tankliff, who was himself wrongfully convicted and spent almost 18 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Our students in that class have reinvestigated a series of wrongful conviction cases, and we've already helped to secure the exoneration of Valentino Dixon, who had served 27 years in Attica. And we have more exonerations to come. Stay tuned. Second, our Prison Scholars Program is a credit-bearing educational program that offers Georgetown classes, both credit and non-credit, to incarcerated residents at the DC jail. We'll soon be expanding to a Maryland prison where we'll be launching a bachelor's degree granting program. So in a few years, I look forward to hosting Georgetown graduations in a prison and to counting incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people as Georgetown Hoyas and alumni. Third, Georgetown also has the first ever university program for returning citizens called the Pivot Program. It's a partnership between the Prisons and Justice Initiative and the McDonough School of Business. And of course, we work closely with the DC government. It's a year-long paid program that blends top-notch instruction in business and entrepreneurship with practical internships with DC area businesses and nonprofit associations. We're now in the middle of our 3rd cohort, and our participants and graduates have a fantastic track record in terms of their job placements and their life outcomes. And they are setting the example for why second chances are so important. And they're showing that returning citizens can become valuable employees and community members, and indeed leaders. So overall, the Prisons and Justice Initiative in Georgetown are working every single day to change this country's horrible system, to break down its original sin of racism and slavery, and to set a new and better example for human potential and real second chances. So now I'd like to turn to Tyrone Walker, who is himself a participant in 2 of our programs, who is a dear friend and a great inspiration to me, and who, as they say, bleeds Hoya blue. Welcome, Tyrone.
Thank you, Professor Howard. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, thanks to the 13th Amendment, that the chains of slavery are still in existence today. Yes, you may not see your ordinary auction blocks of slavery, but it exists. And exists right here in the nations, right there at Grand Prairie, Texas. There's a complex about 500 employees that work there, what they call a Security and Designation Center. Within that Security and Designation Center, it determines what person go to what institution. If you ever been through Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, if you ever been through Harrisburg Airport, or any other LAX, Oklahoma, it's a section of the airport that is deemed, to all of us who've been back there, the new auction block for slavery. They no longer trade flax seeds, tobacco, and alcohol for people. Now they trade shackles, leg irons, handcuffs, and oh yes, black boxes. There's a staff on Every one of these airplanes or buses, you no longer see ships, slave ships. Now they're flying. We say they was below deck. Now they're up on the deck. They're up in airplanes. These airplanes land at these airports, and you see countless of buses with black and brown bodies on them, and they all have shackles on them, handcuffs, belly chains, and oh yes, black boxes. Black boxes are put on people so they can't move their arms even when they go to eat. Their hands are stuck right near their navel, and they trying to eat a cold bologna sandwich. Slavery exists even in the names that's placed on the ID cards, where it says inmate. Anytime you restrict my dignity as a person, you are in fact enslaving me. Anytime that you try to take dignity away from any people, you are enslaving that people. And so we see it today, even on Wall Street, where they privatize people's ills. So now slavery just don't exist through the 13th Amendment. And the federal government has now partnered with privatized prisons to say that we're going to keep your prisons at a certain percentage capacity, at least 80% capacity. And when I first read that, I was like, how do you know, can you keep that prison at that capacity if you don't know that you're going to arrest a lot of black and brown bodies? So yes, slavery do exist. Today, all of us wore those. I remember I was coming back, planning to be released in 2017. They put the black box on me so tight. I looked the man in his eyes and I told him, I said, this is your last time doing that. And I said, make it as tight as you can get it, because this is the last ride. It exists today anytime that you have to live with another person in a 6x8 and that person have to use the bathroom. You don't have anywhere to go. So the dignity of people are always being challenged who are in this legacy in this contemporary day of slavery. Anytime that you place us in these situations, even it starts in the communities where they're living in food deserts, they living in redlining, they living in ghettos. And so people act a certain way because they're trying to survive in that situation. And those situations lead them because it's systematically into the system. And the only answer that the government have for black and brown bodies is to incarcerate. We have become overly reliant on incarceration in this nation, with nearly 2.3 million people incarcerated. And from anywhere, it is so troubling when you can check any silo and see that it's anywhere from 219,000 to 229,000 women that are incarcerated. When I learned these numbers and I look, I was like, and this is the fastest growing population of incarceration is our women. And we see it and we see it today as live, and it's painful. Thank you.
Professor Allen Bell.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm here to speak to you just a little bit about the continuing legacy of over 120 years of non-unanimous juries being used in Louisiana. Many of you are probably aware of this historic vote that changed the jury system in Louisiana from a non-unanimous system to a unanimous jury system. And all that means is that when we were a non-unanimous jury system, we would seat 12 jurors and one or two might raise reasonable doubt, and we would simply ignore the one or two and allow convictions in the state of Louisiana with as few as 10 jurors saying that there was guilt. That system was changed by the voters in Louisiana, and also it prompted litigation that ended the same system in Oregon. I want to talk to you about a transformative experience that I had at the watch party as I waited for those results to come in 2018. I saw things that shaped the next years of my life. That night, I saw people actually wearing shirts, had letters on the front of the shirt saying things like, "We killed Jim Crow." I saw certain people with chants going out, yelling, "Welcome back, Sixth Amendment." I actually saw cakes, "Jim Crow is dead." And all of this energy in the room, I thought about whether we really fully processed what actually just got accomplished in Louisiana. I think we were all suffering from a case of short-sightedness. I think that we did not understand that there had been some vows exchanged long before the work started on dismantling this particular injustice. We did not understand that there was so much more than just the change in the jury system and the Sixth Amendment. There was so much more at stake that none of us really understood that night. None of us realized that we were dealing with deep-rooted levels of oppression that had very little to do with the jury system in the end. We didn't know that the opponents were not just the local district attorneys and the local attorney general, but there were people who had long been put to their graves. We did not know that the 1898 Constitutional Convention in Louisiana was not actually the starting point. It was likely the ending point of this effort. But what I want us to do now is to examine some of the words that you will see on that transcript. These are the words that we spoke to potential voters, and these are the words that persuaded voters. And somehow, what was very critical in this particular movement has been overlooked. Mr. Krusenick was the president of that 1898 Constitutional Convention, and he speaks very subtly of an unknown marriage between race, voting, and juries in this state, not just in the Louisiana, in the nation as well. What he says, I want to quote, is that constitutional convention that assembled to change Louisiana's law to make the jury system non-unanimous, he says, "We did this for two things." The first reason, he says, and I quote, "It was to protect the purity of the ballot box." The second reason, he says, and this is a quote, "to perpetuate the supremacy of the Anglo-Saxon race in Louisiana." The Reconstruction debates are necessary for us to really process the full meaning of these words. So when we look to those debates, they tell us a few things about criminal justice that informs today's conversations. When the congressmen were talking about the 1866 Civil Rights Act, you have Representative Stephen Douglas trying to calm his very outraged colleagues, and he assures them that this particular Civil Rights Act that they're getting ready to enact, he says, and I'm quoting, "It will only protect the enjoyment of their civil rights." And I'm calling attention to civil rights. He continues, "They will not be made equal to whites. They will not be allowed to serve on juries, and they will not be allowed to vote because those are called political rights." I am emphasizing political rights. And then there is further discussion from Mr. James Wilson, who says, "Well, wait a minute. Do we mean that these people will vote if we enact this legislation? Absolutely not. That's not what we mean, because that would be conferring a political right." And then he says, "So what we're really trying to do is just make sure they can't sit on juries, they can't vote, We just want to give them their civil rights. And there is an assent that civil rights simply would mean individual rights, such as the right to personal property and liberty. Then when they get to the 14th Amendment, it gets even more unsettling because there is this question of what do you mean by equal protection in the Equal Protection Clause? And there is, of course, all white men in this room, all white men in power at this moment in history. And it is a startling question. So it is, do you mean equal as in women being equal to us, the white male power majority? Certainly you could not mean that in the 14th Amendment. And then they go on to say, well, wait a minute, what about Black folks? When you enact this 14th Amendment and call them citizen, are you trying to make them maybe equal to me, the white male power majority? No, maybe what you really mean to do is suggest equal protection means Black equal to Black. So what we see here is a vote cast on 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, Civil Rights Act of 1866, with a lack of real clear understanding about the very fundamental terms that would mean what life would look like in this country for those newly freed people. We're not clear on what freedom really meant when we agreed to free these people. We're not really clear on what equality in citizenship meant. And I would argue that as a nation, we have never really established an answer to any of those questions. So what we do know is they left that room with a will to simply grant civil rights. The intention was never to grant political rights. And what do I mean by political rights? I mean the right to hold office, the right to cast a vote, the right to serve on a jury. And so against this backdrop, I ask you to consider this larger conversation of criminal justice and how far we have actually traveled. What does it really mean when we cast a vote? What it means is that we are exercising the only exercise of rights to protect ourselves against the government. What does it mean when we serve on a jury? It means that we are protecting innocent people from prosecutors and judges, and we're even engaging in an act of self-government. What does it mean when, in fact, we are doing the work of serving on a jury? We're actually just casting a vote. So all of these functions are an attempt to exercise political rights by a people who were never intended to have those very political rights. So now I want you to think about a few things. How did Louisiana shape its system? They used the voting records to decide how many of the likely voters would end up on these juries. And then they said, okay, it's going to be 2 or 3. So that's the number that we're going to marginalize. So they use voting records to shape the law on juries. I want you to also think about during the slavery era. Were the enslaved allowed to vote? No, they could not. Were they allowed to sit on juries? No, they could not, because they had no political rights and they had no civil rights. So as we confront the legacy of slavery, we must not make the mistake of indiscriminately celebrating changes. We must instead look for signs of progress. In 2001, African Americans remain similarly situated to where they were on those plantations. They are routinely deprived of the right to vote. They are routinely removed from juries or either not even called to serve on those juries. We are suffering as a nation from the same short-sightedness that I actually observed as those votes were coming in that night in the room. We have failed to fully assess the critical relationships here in these criminal justice conversations. So as I attempt to synthesize this in my closing, I would suggest that you consider that a jury is engaged almost to a vote. And a vote is wedded to political equality. And supremacy happened to have written these vows. Injustice happened to have been the officiant. And it turns out political equality has been having an affair with criminal justice. So now that we know this, reformers have to make some tough decisions. Do we just maybe want to divorce ourselves from this work? This is just too painful, we can't do it. Or do we maybe want to consider a postnuptial where we can look at the terms of this union and revisit them? As we struggle with this decision, we may want to consider what the late John F. Kennedy would have said to us as we think about which we might be best suited to do. He would warn us that there are risks and costs to actions, and there are far less than the long-range risks of comfortable inaction. I thank you for your attention.
So let me jump in here and just say thank you to Mark, to Tyrone, and to Angela Allen Bell for those powerful comments. And I will add one dimension to this. As Mark said, I am the director of the Juvenile Defender Clinic over at Georgetown Law School. And before that, I was an attorney at the DC Public Defender Service. In total, I have been representing children arrested in the District of Columbia for 26 years. What is shocking about my work is that in that entire time, I have only represented 4 white clients. That's it. 4 white clients in 26 years. So my 1 to 99% ratio would lead you to believe that I live in a city that is predominantly Black or that no white kids commit crime in DC. And neither of those assumptions would be true. In fact, only about 52% of court-aged children in the district are Black. And data shows that youth of all races engage in the same type of risky adolescent behaviors that could be considered delinquent. So how did we get here with disparities that are that extreme? We cannot understand contemporary criminalization of Black youth without understanding the history of the evolution of juvenile court in America and the history of punishment of Black children accused of crime. The bottom line is that we live in a country that has never viewed Black children as children. So of course, during slavery, Black children were treated as the property of the slave master. So when children committed a crime like stealing extra food, they were whipped or otherwise punished without due process and without any oversight of the masters by the state. Between emancipation and 1899, children of all races were accused, who were accused of crimes, were sent to criminal courts to be tried and sentenced like adults. But then in the mid 1800s, a group of progressive reformers called child savers became concerned about the welfare of children and fought to remove young people from adult courts and prisons and to create new specialized reform schools and juvenile courts that would treat rather than punish, that would treat and rehabilitate the children rather than punishing them. Unfortunately, from the outset, early juvenile justice reformers were not interested in rehabilitating Black children, but instead focused their energy on assimilating poor European immigrant youth into the virtuous middle-class citizens that they saw themselves as. Black youth were never seen worthy of these rehabilitative efforts among reformers who believed that Black youth didn't have the physical, moral, or intellectual capacity to be assimilated, and who thought, quite frankly, that Black parents or Black mothers in particular were unable to supervise and raise morally moral and responsible children. So when some of the first child welfare institutions finally opened their doors to Black children, they didn't even pretend to rehabilitate them, but instead relegated them to the colored section of the facilities. Black boys were trained to meet the agricultural and other manual labor needs of the day. Black girls were trained to be cooks, maids, seamstresses, and were denied the educational and recreation services that white youth received. Finally, as European immigration came to an end after World War I, Black youth eventually displaced white immigrants as the disproportionate target of juvenile court proceedings. But the goal was not to treat them, but to demonize them. And then there was this second wave of juvenile court reform, which began with the civil rights protests of the 1960s and lasted until the late 1990s, when politicians basically rejected this rehabilitation philosophy in favor of law and order responses to adolescent offending. And that shift was a response first to the social disorder and racial unrest that made folks uncomfortable in the civil rights movement. And second, it was a response to the crack epidemic and the easy access to guns in the 1980s and 1990s, which led to a temporary spike in violent crime, specifically among young Black males between the ages of 14 and 24. But here's the key takeaway. In these moments of fear and uncertainty in our country, Black youth have been demonized by the media and by conservative politicians. Black youth were labeled and exaggerated as super predators and became the principal targets of the war on crime and the war on drugs. But then, even as crime dropped in the 2000s, and we entered the third and current wave of juvenile court reform, which has restored the rehabilitative philosophy, come full circle, and now draws heavily upon what we know about adolescent development and adolescent brain science, the fears and the criminalization of Black youth has never subsided. And so we see this play out today in at least three different ways. First, in the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors among Black children, right? So for example, Black kids being arrested for things like disturbing schools when they're out of place, failing to pay attention in class, or talking back to an adult, whereas a white child would never be arrested, handcuffed, dragged out in these embarrassing ways that are undignified. Second, we see this in the hyper surveillance and over policing of Black youth in their day-to-day lives. And so here I am talking mostly about the police, but I am also talking about what I call policing by proxy, to capture the many ways in which civilians are watching and policing Black children in schools, in the community, in the recreation centers, on the internet and the like. And then third, we see this in the dehumanization of Black children at the back end of the system, at the sentencing phase. And so we just don't treat Black children with the same grace, compassion, and understanding of adolescence that we do for white children. And so when I think about the link between slavery, Jim Crow, and the contemporary criminalization of Black youth, it is no coincidence that Black youth are heavily policed and surveilled in adolescence, one of the most important times in their development. Criminalization of Black adolescents has always served its purpose well in establishing the boundaries of whiteness and Blackness, in limiting the identity and potential of Black youth, meaning who they think they are now and who they can become in the future, and essentially in eliminating Black youth from the economy, from the social order, and from politics. So I will stop there. We'll talk in Q&A about how do we get out from under this.
Good afternoon. In 1866, a U.S. colored troops corporal delivered a public speech celebrating the state of Virginia's decision to recognize Black marriages. Like many emancipated persons who've been denied freedom and dignity for too long, he believed that the marriage covenant, to include family ties that it supported, was, and I quote, at the center, at the foundation of all our rights. In slavery, he explained, we could not have legalized marriage. Now we have it, and we shall be established as a people. Of course, many emancipated persons at this time cherished the opportunity to build families of their own choosing in the wake of slavery. At the same time, the institution of the family post-emancipation became a site of racial subordination and white control in this period as well. It was no accident, for example, that white landowners looked to resurrect the South they had known prior to the war, and to ensure that any of the negative insecurity of African Americans, any of their internal, or I should say, any of the needs that they needed addressed would be internalized not by whites, but by African American families. Similarly, at this time, Black parents, as they tried to address the needs that they had in the wake of emancipation, found themselves very often being imprisoned for their inability to care for their children, to provide them with the food that they needed or shelter that they had. Now, worse still for those parents was that they had to stand by and watch as their children were removed from their homes and required to labor in what they called apprentices for white, apprenticeships for white plantation owners. Now, I started talking about marriage and family on a panel that so far has talked a lot about criminal justice and about juries. So those of you in the audience might be wondering, what does family have to do with this panel and the legacies that slavery has left us? But I want to suggest that families have everything to do with what we're talking about today. We must look, I think, well beyond systems that, to some extent, we've become comfortable talking about: criminal justice, incarceration. These are important, but I want to argue that if we want to be able to move beyond talking about these kinds of issues only, and to get a real deep understanding of the true legacy of slavery in the 21st century, we've got to open up the range of issues that we discuss in this context. In many ways, the family is the through line if you will, that we need to be paying attention to. Debates about structural racism that were launched in the wake of George Floyd's death and the death of Breonna Taylor suggests that we need to sort of open up the lenses that we deploy in this context to really understand what we need to do to improve our current context. It is, the family is where so many of the intersecting vectors that inform Black life and inequality come together. And they're the source of the staying power of racial inequality in this context as well. So if I had to sort of wrap things up in a bow, I would say this very simply, that Black families matter in ways that we don't always appreciate, but that we should. Now, in my work, I've talked a lot about the example of Walter Scott, who was an African-American man who was shot in the back by a white North Charleston police officer after he ran away from the officer during a routine traffic stop. Now, thanks to the video that's become so important in the stories that we're seeing in the news and in public, many people appreciated the horror and the injustice of how Walter Scott had been treated. But for many people, it wasn't really until they understood why he had run away that they understood or that they appreciated the depth of the problem. Turns out that Walter Scott ran in part because he owed back child support. And he was worried first, of course, that he would not have an opportunity to remain in contact with his children if he was incarcerated, but also that he might lose the job that he had obtained and was using to support the well-being of his children. Now, there are a number of issues that I think are important in this context. I won't go through all of them, but I'll just say that I hope that as we move forward in our conversation, we can talk about systems like the welfare system, where you see many families being treated in a way that does not appreciate the challenges that they face, are not supported in their efforts to care for their children, are very often find their children being removed from welfare workers. We have problems like parents being incarcerated for deciding to enroll their children in an educational program in a school outside of the district where they are legally supposed to attend. When we have issues like that, where parents are experiencing the loss of control over their children and face incarceration because they dare to challenge or recognize the effects of segregation and try to find a way to allow their children to get the full benefit of education provided to others. These are the kinds of things that I think are a direct legacy of slavery. We don't talk about them in that way, but for reasons that other panelists have already discussed, I think it is more than appropriate to talk about those kinds of issues in that valence. I think I had a couple other things that I wanted to say, but I'm going to stop here and I'll take the opportunity in Q&A to say a little bit more. What I want to suggest, however, is that the family needs to be much more centered in our conversations about inequality, and that we could use the family to the extent that so many of the vectors that are key in understanding the operation of inequality really flow through the family. When someone comes home from being incarcerated, they're going to come home to family, to people who are going to support them. That kind of structure can be something that we draw on and utilize as we try to make change in this realm. So I'll stop here.
Great, thank you, Robin, and thank you to all the panelists for your wide-ranging and really insightful remarks. I want to remind the audience that we have a hard stop at 3 p.m., but we are taking audience questions. They're being filtered and passed on to us. So if you have questions, please send them in. And I want to start us off with a common question for all the panelists, and I'll ask us maybe to go in the reverse order. So the question really, it's about a call to action, right? Because I think that all of us have identified significant problems, ties that go back to slavery where it all began, and legacies of them that live on today. And the question is, what can be done about them? How can this be fixed? Is it just a matter of just keep on pushing and hoping? Or are there new dimensions that we should be taking into consideration to try to break through, to try to undermine, or perhaps to tear down and rebuild? So Robin, why don't you start, and then we'll go to Kristen and then Angela and Tyrone.
So my first answer is that we always have to keep pushing, because what else can we do? So that has to be part of it. But the idea that we need to be pushing in the right direction, that we move in the right direction, is something that we also need to do. We learned a lot in the last year or so about how lots of systems work. I'm thinking about COVID and housing issues and work issues for Black and Brown people that have come to the fore, that people are paying attention to now. What I think is most important is that any strategy that is developed and implemented really pays attention to the need to address issues, intersecting issues at a number of different places. And I'll just give you an example of a program that the Bail Fund created. I sit on the board of that organization. They created a program in Oklahoma for women to try to help them First, in part because women are the fastest growing folks in prisons currently, but also because of the very varied ways or challenges that women face in their lives. They're the caregivers for children, for elderly people. They're the people who are working. They're trying to deal with all these issues. And what the bail fund said is, you know, we're not just going to focus on bail. We're going to do more than that. We're going to do that, and we're also going to get you a lawyer to help you deal with the child custody issues that that might come up. We're also going to deal with the child care issues that come up. We're going to have a lawyer that helps you try to hold on to your job in this context. And I think if we don't address things in a very multifaceted way, we're going to find ourselves back here again having a conversation that hasn't moved very much and has the same problems at its center.
And so let me just state very quickly, as we think about how to decriminalize Black adolescents, we need a massive cultural shift that gets folks to understand that Black children are children too. And that's going to take a long time. And I am a pragmatist. And so until then, as we do this work of altering the narrative, I think there are some very quick practical things that we can do, one of which is radically reducing the footprint of police officers in the lives of Black and brown children. So that means police-free schools, that means statutory reform that decriminalizes normal adolescent behaviors. That means regulations that reduce the unnecessary and aggressive stops and frisks of Black and brown children. I also think that we have to invest in alternatives to law enforcement responses to adolescents, right? That means adopting a public health approach to public safety. It means investing in young people directly instead of in buildings and in institutions and in law enforcement. And then finally, it means that when police do have to come in contact with children, we must insist upon and hold police officers accountable for adolescent appropriate, developmentally appropriate police contacts, which involves training, it involves regulations on the use of force, requirements about de-escalation techniques. So those are my three themes in the meantime, until we get everyone to understand that Black children are children too.
And I would advocate for a transitional justice approach to reforming this particular justice system. And transitional justice is really used quite a bit around the globe. It's underused in the United States, but it suggests that if you have had a system where you've had years of civil and human rights abuses, and you want to transition to something that is a lot more healthy for your population, you want to look at maybe reforming your system. How do you do that? Because maybe we need to prosecute people. Maybe we need to think about some way of granting reparations. Maybe we need to even just confront the truth telling. So I am a proponent of transitional justice, and it would be my thought that if we were going to implement this, the first step would be truth telling. We have not been honest about what our criminal justice system is, what it was designed to do. And once we teach the public that, we can then address the idea of reforming it. But for example, the public still believes that this system was about public safety, and it was not about that ever. For example, Louisiana's biggest prison, Angola, was purchased by a Confederate general who had just been put out of business at the end of the Civil War. He had nowhere to go, nothing to do for employment. So he goes to the state and says, I have a good idea. I think I can house your inmates on a plantation, by the way, the one the Confederate general used to own. It's still called Angola, but nobody understands that Angola started because Samuel James had been put out of work by the Civil War. So if we could tell the truth, then people would better understand that we cannot reform such a system because the system is working according to the design plan. We have to go back and revisit what we mean when we say corrections and what we mean by public safety as a nation, and then start planting some seeds on much more fertile soil. So transitional justice is my argument for how we would reform the system. And I do not believe it is beyond repair, but we're at the very early stages of simply telling the truth, which we have not done as a nation.
And I'm more of the stance of dealing with more of the restorative justice, right? Because like when people are hurt, right, and there's no mending of those ways of a person being hurt, then that hurt still be there. And so people start advocating for stiffer penalties, right? Because like, I've never been apologized to, just told me I'm sorry, right? I apologize. Or if someone's loved one has lost their life, nobody will say, listen, this is why that happened, because a lot of time people just want to know why. If they never get these answers, they carry on for this hurt. And then they continue on advocating for laws that they really don't understand because they are hurt. And I think we need to do more restorative justice, and we need to have more deterrence. And when I say deterrence, I'm talking about things in the community. We need to put things in these communities to help these Black and brown young boys to keep them from entering the system. So we got to have these things in place. Thank you.
And I'll answer my own question in 30 seconds by saying I agree with all of the above. And I would add another dimension, although Kristen alluded to it herself, which is cultural change, in my mind, comes through a move from a mindset that had demonization at its core to one based on humanization. And I've actually started an organization, the Frederick Douglass Project for Justice, douglassproject.org. People can look it up. What we're doing is bringing to life Bryan Stevens' principle, which is that proximity creates human connection. And once you've had that, you can't go back to demonization. So humanization defeats demonization. And I hope that's something we'll be able to do. We're almost out of time, and we have a few questions from the audience that I want to be able to share. One gets on this question of abolition of police and prisons as opposed to reform, right? And I think actually Angela mentioned this already, that perhaps it cannot be reformed. It needs to be brought down and started up again. And then another question, I'll just put it out there and let a few people answer very quickly, which has to do with this question reads, while staff and faculty may be fully on board with efforts and initiatives to support structural and systemic change, especially when it comes to contemporary legacies of slavery, how would you suggest dealing with alumni that object, particularly top donors? I certainly have an answer to that one, but if someone wants to jump in on either one of these questions, but really probably 30 seconds each, since we're really almost out of time.
I will jump in, Professor Howard, on the abolitionists, right? And the reform. And I think that, right, that really need to be thought about, because like when we talk about specific crimes, people don't want a person living next to them. They know that they are labeled a child sex offender. So where would this person go? And we talking about tearing down the system, like we just saw a mass shooting in Indianapolis. Where would this person go? So I say, man, when we talk about abolitionists, like we need to like really think about when we talk about tearing the system down, we saying tearing it down completely. It's something to think about.
And I would just say this, that I think when people use the word sort of abolition of policing, that it's not as radical as it sounds, right? That basically what we're saying is a reimagining of our purposes, right? So if as Professor Alan Bell said, if the purpose were genuinely public safety, then how do we achieve that? And for example, with young people, the research shows that policing actually doesn't improve public safety. In fact, it harms public safety. So the point here is using police officers or finding the alternatives to police officers, such as mental health counselors, restorative justice options, violence interrupters, things of that nature that are more appropriate than policing. So yes, it's an abolition of policing in spaces in which they didn't belong and don't belong in the first place.
Does anyone else have an answer? I would otherwise, go ahead.
I'll quickly respond concerning the donor, because I think it's important that the leadership and administration of a school have a commitment to the school's mission. And then any donations that follow should come on the condition that they are being given to enhance the mission of the school. So a donor should not be able to influence the work of a school. A donor should simply be there to support the work of a school. So if that donor is carrying that type of influence, I would read that as a lack of leadership. And that needs to be clear that there are certain checks that you may not want if they're going to come with those kind of conditions.
And I think we unfortunately have to close out the panel, but I will say that at Georgetown, we've had the opposite experience. We've had our top leadership completely embrace this cause and this research and these programs. And we've been very successful with donors. I think initially there's a sense of fear, but in reality, the country has changed, the country is changing. And I think that strong leadership yields results. And it actually, rather than run away from it, one should lean into it. And that's certainly been our experience. So I wanted to say it was a great honor. Robin, did you want to get a word in?
No, I was gonna give a plug for the Racial Justice Institute.
Yes.
That would not exist without the leadership that we've seen here at Georgetown, and I couldn't agree more that leading in the right direction is what you need, and donors will come along and they may surprise themselves once they get involved with the kinds of things that are happening here at Georgetown. So.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's a great way to close it out. I want to say it was a great honor for me to moderate this panel, to share this space with you. Thank you all for your insights and for the work that you're doing. And thank you to our audience.